Good afternoon. Let's get started. Welcome to the first installment of the fall series of the UT Energy Symposium. How many of you are here for the first time? Very good. Wow, great. Welcome. We have been doing this for about 4 years now, and this is the 9th semester, and we do this every Thursday, 5:15 to 6:15. I will remind you that this works both as a class as well as an open public forum. So there are several of you who are formally registered for this course for 1 credit. And some of you who are interested can actually explore, go online and find there are ways actually you can get credit for this. Let me also remind you that for those of you who are registered for this course, within the next 24 hours, you have to go on Canvas and post on the discussion board. That's a course requirement. We keep track of it. So if you don't post, you will hear from us about that. If you have any questions, you can write to me, or Vivek Nath at the very back is the TA for this course. So you can also write to Vivek if you have any questions. We will have, just in terms of format, we'll have about 40 minutes of 35-40 minutes of talk from our guest, and then we'll move into Q&A for about 15-20 minutes. We give preference to students first, and then we'll move to, as time allows, move to the broader public for Q&A. So please bear with us. That's the normal format that we follow. Before I introduce our speaker today, let me announce our speaker next week. It's going to be Dr. Ariane Beck. Ariane is a research fellow here at UT, and she will talk to us on energy games, use of gamification for decision-making, and behavior change in the adoption of solar photovoltaic technologies. It's use of some very cutting-edge experimental research in messaging and addressing information gaps that happen in adoption of new technologies and new ideas. So please join us next week. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Professor David Popp, who is the professor of public administration and international affairs at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. David is an economist, and his interests are in environmental policy and the economics of technological change. In particular, he is interested in studying the links between environmental policy and innovation with a focus on technologies that are relevant for combating climate change. This is an area which I study also, and I can tell you firsthand that David's work has had a very deep and broad impact in the field. Almost all papers that I write in this area, I end up citing so much of David's work because many of the main ideas his work has actually touched and addressed in very fundamental ways. So he's very widely published and widely cited. He's published in almost all the top economic journals. He's also co-editor for 2 very important journals in the field, for the Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economics and the Environmental and Resource Economics Journal. He has been a consultant for many international and national bodies. He has a long list of honors and awards and achievements, which I'm not going to go through here. But we are honored that you're here, David, made the time. Many of us have been wanting to meet you and hear from you for a long time. He has a PhD in economics from Yale University, and we look forward to hearing from you, David. Welcome.
Thank you very much. A lot to live up to now in the next 45 minutes, so I appreciate that. All right. So my talk today is going to touch on some recent research that I've been doing to evaluate the impact of public energy R&D, so money that's spent by governments rather than money in the private sector. So it's a little different than a lot of the other stuff I've done. And I'm going to touch on a lot of stuff. I know we have a very wide range of people in the audience. There'll be a couple of technical slides for people that want to know about methodology. There's a lot of stuff in English that's just kind of describing the intuition of what's going on. So for those of you that don't want to see the methodology, we'll kind of put everything in context. I'm going to focus more on results rather than on methods and stuff, but we hopefully have a little bit here for everybody. So, public R&D plays a very important role in energy. So we know that if we want to achieve significant reduction in climate change, we're going to need breakthroughs in the current set of renewable technologies. We're going to need to be able to lower costs. So as an example of this, is there a pointer of this? I don't know if there's a, so recent research by the International Energy Association suggests that we increase public R&D expenditures by a factor of 2 to a factor of 5. We want to meet the targets that are currently being talked about in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. Right? But there hasn't been as much work on the effectiveness of public R&D versus private R&D. And so what I want to talk about today is kind of what we do know, and then what can we learn and what still needs to be done. So in this talk, I'm going to start by reviewing some of the existing research, talk about some of the main lessons that are out there, present some new research that I'm doing, and then just more importantly, talk about the implications of this research, both for policy and for future research on this topic. Okay, so we'll start with some of the existing work. So the existing work looking at public R&D spending focuses on three main areas. So there's some modeling work that tries to simulate, how much should governments spend on R&D versus how much should governments just regulate to try to address climate change, energy technologies. There's a set of empirical studies, including stuff that I've been involved with, trying to link public R&D to research outcomes. Most of that's looked at patents, though, rather than publications that I'm going to do here. And then finally, there's some work looking at knowledge flows between sectors. So if there's work done in the government, how often does that get cited by patents in the private sector? So are different sectors actually impacting each other? Okay. In terms of the modeling research, the most important lesson from this, and probably one that we'll come back to probably at the end of the talk, is that energy R&D plays a supporting role, but it has to be used in tandem with other policies. Okay? So it's not as simple as just spending money on R&D and then walking away. Okay? And the reason for that is when we're dealing with new energy technologies, you need to have demand for the technologies. Right? Cleaner technologies that currently have higher costs. Right? So using wind, using solar, in most cases, are going to have a higher cost. There are some cases, if you're talking to people today, Texas has gotten to the point where wind actually is cost competitive, but that's not the case in a lot of places. And energy is a little different than other technologies. Comparing it to doing research in the life sciences, doing research in ICT. Because people really, what they care about is the end product. They care about the electricity that's coming out of the plug. They don't really care so much about where it came from. Right? And so we need to have incentives in place to have people to use cleaner technologies. Okay. So as a result of this, studies show that R&D can be part of a portfolio of policy, but it can't be the only thing. Right? So a couple papers here on top, so some work I did about 10 years ago. And what we did in this paper is we simulated a couple different ways of looking at climate policy. So we had using a carbon tax or using an R&D subsidy as policy options. And we looked at what happens if we do both of them together. What happens if we use just one of the two? If we use just the carbon tax, we do pretty well. We get about 95% of the welfare gain that we would have had if we used both policies together. If we use the R&D subsidy without a carbon tax, we only get about 11% of the welfare gain. Right? And the reason for that is without the carbon tax, right, we get new technologies, but there's not a lot of incentive to use those technologies. Right? And so having both policies in tandem is important. Right? Fisher and Newell did a paper in 2008 that gets cited a lot where they modeled the U.S. electricity sector and looked at different types of policies that could be used, some more detailed policies like renewable share requirements that are used in Texas, for example. And the R&D subsidy ranked as the least efficient. Still, this is a ranking of each one individually. It still plays a role within a portfolio, but by itself, it doesn't do that much. The one exception to that, some recent work that's been done by a team of researchers at MIT, Doron Asamoglu is the lead author in this, suggests that there was one potential role for R&D to play a bigger role, and that is that they think about the long-run impact of R&D. If the technology is far behind, so we talk about here about the the difference between what they call clean energy and brown energy in the paper. Right? If the clean energy is far behind, then the private sector might not be willing to invest in it. And so public R&D can kind of give a jump start to get the private sector willing to invest in it. Right? The trick with that is it kind of becomes a timing thing. You can start out with R&D subsidies at first. There's still a role for a carbon tax, but what they do is it's a timing thing. So they'll do the R&D first to get the cost down. Then as the costs come down, we can gradually phase the R&D subsidy out, increase the carbon tax. So we still need to have that policy in place, but it's a question of when is it going to take place. Next set of work have been studies that look at the outputs. And most of the work that's been done so far use patents as the outputs. So looking at patents in different renewable energy technologies. So the question here is, does government R&D spending eventually lead to new marketable technologies? So a paper that I did in 2002, this is one of the first papers looking at patent data, shows that it does have an effect, but it's a small effect. Energy prices are more important. When energy prices are higher, we do more research into alternatives. There's a big change in the 1970s and 80s. So back in the 70s, government R&D tended to be a substitute for private R&D. And for those of you that remember the energy research that was taking place back then, one of the problems was a lot of the research was very applied in nature. Right? In the 80s, the government moved towards focusing more on basic R&D. And when they did focus more on basic R&D, there did tend to be somewhat of a complementary effect, that there would be some impact on patenting. Right? There's a bunch of recent studies, and I list them all here, that do find a positive relationship between public R&D and patents. There's a couple concerns with them, though. One is that most of these studies, in my model, I use a bunch of legs. So we actually look over how many years does it take for R&D to have an impact. A lot of these just use a single year's worth of data. Right? And it's hard to believe that the R&D that we spend this year can really have a big impact on patents next year. Right? And there's also a concern with what economists call endogeneity, right? That the same things that cause the government to want to spend more on R&D are also the same things that cause people to want to patent. So we need to be able to control for both of those. Finally, there's been a couple studies that look at the role that government R&D plays in technology transfer. So both of these studies that I cite here use patent data to try to look at how are patents cited by different groups. So this first study by Jaffe and Lerner was a case study looking at Department of Energy labs. And what they found, you'll see, is that, it's similar to what I was talking about in my earlier paper, that there was a bunch of policy shifts in the 1980s that focused on technology transfer in the U.S. government. And those did seem to be effective, that there was more citations to government patents after that time, but depending on how applied or how basic the research was, you can think about the time lags. If the research was more basic, it took a while for that transfer to take place. Right? A paper that I did in 2006 found that the energy patents that are sponsored by the government R&D tend to be cited more frequently than other patents, which is somewhat encouraging. We'd like to think that the government's doing stuff that's a little more basic, a little more fundamental. What's particularly interesting of these is that after these policies in the 1980s that encouraged technology transfer, what I call the children of these patents, so the private sector patents that cite those, tend to be the ones that are even the most frequently cited, which suggests that there's an important technology transfer role here, that there's kind of a translational work being done, that the private sector is doing things that make this even more marketable, and those are the innovations that tend up being the most important. So with this framework in mind, we'll talk about some recent research that I've been doing using scientific publications rather than patents to be able to evaluate public R&D. Okay. For those that are interested, this is available right now as the National Bureau of Economic Working Paper, so the number is up there. The motivation for this, as I mentioned before, you would expect there to be a long leg. Government R&D tends to focus on more basic parts of the R&D process. So we might expect it to be a long time between when the work first gets done and then when it leads to a final commercial product. Because it really is the commercial product that we care about. But as I said before, a lot of the incentives that determine public R&D also determine private R&D. When there's an energy, you have to go back to the 1970s, when there was an energy crisis, the government spent more on energy R&D, but the private sector also spent more. So trying to determine cause and effect ends up being very challenging. So one of the advantages of using publication data is it gives us kind of an intermediate step in this process. Right? We can think of the first step as the government sponsors research at a university or at a government lab. Scientists get together, they publish something. We can look at that to see, as a first measure of effectiveness, and then as I'll talk about later, we can actually trace that publication to future patents to see how long this entire process takes to occur. So I try to address a couple questions in this research. So one, how does government R&D affect the returns to basic research? Right? We'll look at a couple things. We'll focus on the timing. As I mentioned before, a lot of these studies just focus on a year or two. We really don't have a good sense of how long it takes. So we're going to focus on how long does it take till we see some publications appear. And then we're going to try to link these publications to citations on U.S. patents to see how long until we actually see a commercial product developed that's based on this research. We also want to think about what are the limits to government funding. So there may be adjustment costs. There's been a lot of research looking at the National Institutes of Health, for example. The National Institutes of Health had a doubling of their budget back in the late 90s, and then after a couple years later, that budget was cut. That led to lots of problems for researchers because you have to hire, you bring in new infrastructure, hire new postdocs, then the funding goes away and people are being laid off and there's no place for these researchers to go. So there can be adjustment costs when these funding increases come in big spikes. So you want to see if there's what economists call diminishing returns to government R&D. If we have a big increase at once, is that going to be less effective than if we have kind of a gradual increase over time? Okay. The data for this work comes from the Thomson Reuters Web of Science. So we have data on publications starting in 1991 And going through, I think we went through 2011. Using keywords, we went through and identified four publications for 4 different technologies that we're going to talk about here. So biofuels, energy efficiency, solar energy, and wind energy. The data includes all sorts of descriptive information on these articles. So we know who the authors are. We know their home countries, which is going to be really important for us. So we're going to try to match this up with the R&D spending in their countries. We know the journals they've been published in. We know the articles that cite them. So we can say something about, are these actually influential articles? Are they high quality? Okay. One technical aspect is how do we deal with collaboration? So if there are articles, we count the articles for each technology by year and by country. And then we're going to compare that to the R&D spending of these countries. We weight these by the share of authors. So for example, if there's an article that has 2 authors from the US and 1 from Japan, we would say that article counts as 2/3 of a US article and 1/3 of a Japanese article. Okay. We then take that and we combine that with data from government energy R&D spending by country and by technology. If people are interested, this data is freely available from the International Energy Agency. We're able to match up then for it's mostly high-income countries. It's basically OECD countries, so Europe, US, Japan, Australia. We have about 14 to 15 countries for each one. The availability varies by technology. Some countries we'll talk about, show you a little bit of data in a second, are more active in some technologies than others. Let me start by giving you a sense of what this data looks like. So this is just aggregate data, and I'll have some country slides here next. So the blue in each of these is the amount of R&D spending. This is in US dollars. And then the red is the total publications. As you see, both publications and R&D spending have been increasing, so there's been big increases in the last few years. You'll notice for a lot of these, there's kind of a spike in the R&D. So that is actually, and it shows you how important the US is. That's mostly the US. It's the UK as well. So that's 2009. So as part of the recovery from the financial crisis, there was a big influx of R&D spending. That was a one-time thing. But in general, you'll see that since the early 2000s, there's been big increases. You can kind of see for solar and wind, there was some, if we took this back farther, we took this back in the 70s, this was going up here as well. So there was kind of a first big wave of R&D spending, late 70s, early 80s. Things really flattened out in the 90s, and then in the last 5-10 years have been picking up again. There is variation both across countries and across time. So look at this within countries. So this is for wind, and you can see, so for example, Germany had a lot of spending in wind energy in the 90s, but so they kept their funding up for a while. They eventually flattened out in the 2000s and went back up. Italy did a lot in the first wave, but isn't really doing much now. The US and the UK both had these big spikes, Spain as well with the financial crisis. You'll notice in general, the publication counts tend to follow the R&D spending. There is some, you'd expect the publications will come a little bit after the R&D spending, but for the most part, they tend to move together. The other thing we'll see is there are differences across countries. So for example, Japan, you'll notice, with the exception of the financial crisis, really not spending much on wind energy. But if I go to the next slide and we look at solar, Japan is one of the leading countries in terms of solar energy. So they've spent a lot on solar voltaics. Okay. So what do we do with this data? So we estimate a model to see what the return is on energy R&D spending in terms of these publications. It's a little complicated. So the challenge here is that publications are the outcome of a research process. And to observe it, so compare this to the work done with patents. Right? To observe a patent, all we have to do is it has to meet a certain legal threshold. If it meets a certain legal threshold, the patent's going to be granted. The patent examiner can't say, well, this meets the legal threshold, but I don't find it particularly interesting. Right? A journal editor can. A journal editor can say, well, this looks like a reasonably good project, but this isn't an important topic right now. I'm not going to publish it. Right? So both the supply of articles available to publish and the demand of the journal editors matters. So we have to control for what incentives are faced by the researchers and by the journals that might publish them. What's tricky here is that the factors that influence research also, are going to be things that might also affect private R&D. They're going to be more interest when climate change is on the radar. They're more interest when energy prices are higher. So we need to be able to control for all those things in the model. If we don't control for all those, we have what we call admitted variable bias. So the idea is that we may be picking up something else that's related to the decision to fund R&D rather than the R&D funding it itself. We don't observe alternative funding sources themselves, but we do observe all the factors that affect the availability of these funds. So we're going to control for things like energy prices. We'll control for the renewable policies that are in place in these countries. So to use that helps to deal with the admitted variable bias issue. So we're trying to make sure we're really identifying the effect of energy R&D versus something else. It also complicates the model, though, as the factors that influence demand also might influence the R&D funding decision. This is what economists call endogeneity. There's a couple of ways that we can do that, and I'll kind of explain the tuition as we go through. So one is we use what are called country and year fixed effects. So we try to control for things that are common across the country, over all time periods, or things that are common across all countries within a specific year. Just things that might be influencing some of the funding decisions. We also use a technique called instrumental variables, and what that's doing is it's basically trying to predict what the R&D funding decision would be. I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in a slide or two. Okay. So the one equation I'm going to put up here, so the model that we're going to estimate is we're using panel data, so we have all these technologies. We have publications from 1991 to 2011. The R&D data goes back into the early 80s, so we can have up to 10 years, 11 years of lagged R&D data, so we can look at the time lag in this. We use what's called first differencing, so we're focusing on the changes over time in the model. The model that we're estimating is this. So Q is the quantity of publications, indexed by I and T, so by country and by technology. We have up to 10 years of lags of R&D included, so we can estimate up to 10 different coefficients there. Include various policy variables. Okay? So does a country have a feed-in tariff? Does a country have renewable portfolio standards? So are they doing other things to promote these technologies? Okay? We include a bunch of other controls. I'll talk about those controls in a slide, because the controls vary for each technology. Right? And as I said, we estimate this model both using the instrumental variables technique and assuming the R&D decision is exogenous and not worrying about that kind of collinear choice. We interact the year effects with a dummy variable for the European Union because there is some funding that comes out of the European Union as a whole. That's not in our data. We have country-level data, but not the European Union data, so that tries to adjust for that. And technical thing for those of you that are statisticians, we correct the standard errors for heteroscedasticity and autocorrelation. Okay. We'll talk first about the other variables we include. As I said, they vary by technology, and then I'll talk a bit about the logic of the instrumental variables. So the policy variables for biofuels, we look at gasoline taxes. For solar and wind, we have the renewable energy policies I mentioned before. Some other controls, so for biofuels, for energy efficiency, we care about the prices of gas, the price of electricity. We care about the resources in the country. A country that has more oil reserves, or that has more coal, has more fossil fuels, is likely to care less about investing research in alternative energy sources than a country that doesn't have a lot of alternative energy sources. Right? So we want to control for those resources. For wind and solar, we think about some of the other substitutes. So there's other research that's shown if countries have a lot of hydro or they have a lot of nuclear power, they might not be as interested in using renewables. Right? So France, for example, doesn't have a lot of carbon emissions from its electricity sector because it gets a lot of electricity from nuclear. Right? So there isn't as big a need then to move towards solar or wind as it would be in a country that has less from nuclear. So that's important to control for as well. The other thing that can be important with the electricity sector is the growth rate of electricity consumption. And what that's trying to proxy is there demand for new sources? Right? If there's not a lot of growth, there's not a lot of need for new infrastructure, there's going to be less investment in the renewables than a country where there is a lot of growth, right? Because there's going to be new sources that need to come on. Talk a little bit about the logic of the instrumental variables. So the idea of instrumental variables is basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict how much a country spends on energy R&D and use that predicted information in the model rather than using the actual value. Right? The way we do this, we use a couple different sets of variables. So one is we look at R&D that they spend on other clean technologies that are not exactly similar. So like you'll notice we don't pair up wind and solar because they both are influenced by a lot of the same decisions. But the idea is, if you're willing to spend a lot of money on, let's look at wind here, on biofuels, energy efficiency, suggest you're willing to spend more on alternative fuels. You're probably willing to spend more on wind as well. So that influences the decision to fund wind energy. But R&D spent on biofuels or energy efficiency shouldn't have any impact on how many publications there are related to wind energy. And so that's the logic here. We're trying to find something that predicts the R&D, but doesn't predict publications for that technology. So we use those related technologies. We also use some policy variables that just try to get at how important is the public sector within a country. So we have dummy variables for, is the country conservative or is it liberal at the time? We look at the tax revenues as a share of GDP. We look at government consumption as a share of GDP. So the argument here is that countries that have a bigger public sector are also going to be spending more R&D, R&D from the government as opposed to R&D spent by the private sector. I should clarify that. So for example, if you look at R&D data in the US, about 70% of R&D is done by the private sector. In France, it's about 55% for the private sector. Right? The public sector plays a much bigger role in the French economy than it does in the US economy. Okay, so that's the basic setup of the analysis. I'm going to focus now really going through the results here. There's 4 questions that I want to address as we go through here. So first, I said we're going to focus on the timing. So what is the optimal leg length? How long does it take until the R&D actually leads to new publication? Second, we're going to estimate the effect of government R&D. So how many new articles do we get? Third, I'm going to try to link these publications to patents. So how long does it take until we finally see a new patent come out of this? And then finally, we're going to come back to that question of diminishing returns. So we'll go through results for all 4 of these. After we've done that, we'll talk about some of the more general implications of all of this. Okay. So I'm going to do most of this visually rather than, if anybody's interested in the numbers during the discussion, I've got slides with the results for those who like the technical stuff. I'm going to focus more on graphs and kind of interpretation here. So the first is to look at how long does it take to have an effect. So what these graphs are showing, on the axis here is the cumulative effect. So how many new publications do we get? So the way to think of this is the publications that we get right away. After 1 year, how many do we have? After 2 years, so this is the total effect of all the R&D added up over that time. We estimate this, with just including 1 year's lag, including R&D from years 0, 1, and 2, including R&D from the years 0, 1, 2, and 3 years before, and so on. And what you'll see is that most of these, eventually they start to level out. And there's some statistical stuff we do to actually test where these stop. We're not doing this purely visually. You see it varies for these. So for solar and wind, they tend to level out about 6 or 7 years. Right? So it looks like the effect of the R&D peters out around that time. For biofuels, energy efficiency even picks up again later in the sample, so really at about 10, 11 years. And possible for energy efficiency may even go a little farther, but we don't have the R&D data going back beyond that. So we do see a fairly long leg. That it could be, there's certainly, and I want to just be clear here. I mean, it's not that there's no publications. I mean, there's the biggest jump in biofuels, for example. You go from 0 to year 2, so you do see stuff happening relatively quickly, but the effect persists over a long time. This slide is the same idea, but it's looking at it a little differently. So this is trying to show you what the individual coefficients look like for each individual year. So this is showing what's the effect of R&D in year 0, in year T-1, T-2. So this isn't cumulative. This is just the effect of that 1 year individually. And what the dotted lines give you the confidence interval. So this is the 95% confidence interval. So you'll see that with the 95% confidence interval is above 0 for most of these, even out several years. In general, there's kind of this initial spike. We don't see much impact in year 0. I think that's a good. I think if we did see a lot of impact in year 0, we'd be concerned something was wrong with the model, right? Because funding today should lead to a new publication today. You got to do the work, right? But we do see some publications coming 1, 2 years afterwards. So you see almost all these solar, energy efficiency, wind. We get that kind of initial spike, but there's still at least some new publications coming out. So for wind, year 7, there's still a significant effect there. Energy efficiency, you see it kind of relatively flat. There's a couple little spikes, but there's really no big impact. And again, in biofuels, that kind of cycling effect. One thing that I think is really interesting about this, and something we can't address with this particular set of data, but something I think is worth looking into with more detailed data, is what's going on with these long legs. Particularly, with biofuels, it's almost like it's a cycle, right? You get kind of this initial wave, and then there's another wave that comes in 7, 8, 9 years later. And I think one question that raises is whether this is actually research that's still coming out of that same grant, that's still out of that same project. It's possible. I mean, we're looking at biofuels. It might be that a project involved. And there are researchers, for example, at Syracuse University that are doing research on biofuels from willow trees. And I'm certainly willing to buy. They've got a grant and it takes them a few years to grow the tree, so it might actually, you might actually be some long legs in that. But the other thing that could be interesting is you think of the one role government R&D might play is actually to change the scientific infrastructure, to draw new people into the field, right? So a researcher gets a grant and he hires a couple doctoral students to work in the grant. So now you got a couple doctoral students that are interested in biofuels that didn't know what they were going to do when they came to graduate school. They go out, they graduate. 7, 8, 9 years later, they're out publishing their own research. So to what extent is the research actually affecting the capability, the capability for us, the capacity to do research, as opposed to just affecting that single project? I think that's something that's worth looking at. It's more than we can say with this data here, but something I'm hoping to follow up with on this. The other really important thing is that the government R&D increases publications, the magnitude of the effect varies. You'll notice from the previous slides, the cumulative effect, the extensive energy efficiency is about, for every $1 billion of R&D, there's roughly 1 to 2, 1 to billion and millions. I think I should say millions, not billions. There's, for every $1 million of R&D, there is roughly 1 to 2 new publications that come out of it over the long run. One other thing that's really interesting about this work is that in all the work using patents, government R&D plays a little bit of a role, but the other policies are really important. The feed-in tariffs, the renewable portfolios, energy prices, those all things are really important to drive private sector R&D. We see much less role for those here. Very few of those actually have a significant impact. Right? That's important for two reasons. One is to suggest that what motivates public research, what motivates university research, government laboratory research might be different from what motivates research in the private sector. But it also is important because it suggests that there is, because the same things that influence private R&D don't influence public R&D, it suggests that it's not just one substituting for the other. It suggests that it's not just the public sector doing things for the private that the private sector would have done, right? Because it does seem to be different things that are driving the decision. Okay. I mentioned the instruments, so for those that are interested in the technical stuff, the statistical tests reveal that our instruments are valid. They do work. They do a good job of predicting energy R&D. But we can also test whether we need them. Solar energy is the only case where we see the results change if we don't use the instruments, because the results otherwise are similar, but we do see the difference in solar. Just to be conservative, I use the instrumental variable results for everything, but in general, it doesn't make a big difference whether we use the instruments or not. Okay. The ultimate goal of public R&D, though, is to develop new technologies. Right? So to do this, we link the publications to patents using citations that are found on energy patents. So we collect data on energy patents. We see how often are these articles cited. Right? There's some recent research in management science that show this can actually be really useful. There's been a lot of research at patents looking at citations between patents. Their research actually shows that in terms of measuring knowledge flows from public research, the non-patent citations, the citations to articles, are actually a better measure of that than looking at citations between patents. Okay. And looking at the timing can be useful because it gives us a sense of, again, how long does it take to see results of public R&D. So the way this works, a patent, front page of a patent looks like this. You have some information about the technology, who the inventors are, and so on. There's a bunch of documents that are references. So the references play an important role. So it's actually more important than in academics because they play a legal role. Right? That a reference, what's called narrows the realm, is a legal term, narrows the realm of the patent. What that means is if you've cited something, you can't claim that's part of your idea. So somebody that infringes on your invention, if what they infringe on was also in the cited patent, the person you cite has a claim, but you don't. Okay. So there are patents that are cited. But there's also other research that's cited. So what we did is we went through this other research, and we did two things. We had to identify journal articles. So we have, here's one here. So amazingly enough, and I want to say I did not look for this on purpose. I just randomly pulled a patent. But there was a paper by Tom Wind on wind turbines that offer new voltage control features. So we identify the journal articles, ignore other things. So there's, this patent includes a citation to a web page on Enron's website. It includes a Symposium paper in Yugoslavia, so we ignore those. And then we go through and we match up the publications to see how many of them are in our publication database. This was painstaking work. It paid the bills for a couple RAs, for a couple summers to be able to match all this stuff up. We had to do a lot of it by hand. But we are able to match up. We don't match all there. Some of the articles are not in our database because there's things, for example, there might be a solar patent might cite an article on basic physics that we don't identify because it doesn't have solar in the keyword. But we identified a decent share of them. A couple of key features of this data. One is that it turns out most articles are never cited. Right, so I'll show you some data on that in a second. And the other tricky thing is that a lot of articles, most of our publications are recent. Like, remember, we see the big spike in funding and in publishing at the end of the sample. What that means is that they've had less opportunity to be cited. So you can see that by looking at the data here. So in general, if you were to look at it overall, you'd say, well, this isn't really good. We only, for a U.S. article, we're looking at U.S. patents. So the U.S., I should say, it's all U.S. patents. So the U.S. articles are cited more than foreign ones. But the U.S. articles are only about 2% of them ever proceed with citation. But part of that is because so many of the articles, right? If you look at the number of articles in each period, so many of the articles come from these last 5 years, they're hardly ever cited because they haven't really had a chance to be cited yet. The ones from the earlier periods, the citation rate's about between 5, not quite 10, but between 5 and 10% in general. Right? So it's a little higher than 2%, but still most articles don't get cited. So because of that, we use what's called a hazard model. So we're trying to model the time to citation. Okay. We do this both in the full sample and we consider articles published since 2000 because we do see the citation opportunities change over time. It's a very simple model. It's just a function of how long has it been since the article's been published. We include both the lag between the year of publication of the article and the potential citing year of the patent. We square that so we can allow some flexibility in this function. We also have a dummy variable that's not really important for this that controls for whether it's an article that has authors from multiple countries. We might expect that exposes it to a broader network and leads to more citations. What we see, so this shows the probability of citation. This is the annual probability. This is the cumulative probability. The annual probability peaks about 8 years after the article's been published, which means the cumulative probability, it starts to take off. We see some citations 2, 3, or 4 years after, but it starts to really increase in that 6 to 8 year window, levels out about 10 to 12 years afterwards. But what's important, though, is this is linking the patents to publications. Right? Remember that we also said there's a long lag between when the energy R&D occurs and when the article is actually published. So what this does is it simulates, right, given R&D in a current year, how long would it take for an article to get published, and then once the articles, how many articles do we get published from that, and then how many citations will that lead to? And so that shifts things out. Now it takes about 10 to 12 years, this is for wind here. For biofuels, it goes out a little farther, out to about 12, 14 years after the R&D funding until the probability of a citation peaks. So here again we see that we have the cumulative probability, very few citations until about 6 to 8 years after funding, and that leveling out to about 18 years. Now to be clear on this, this is all using data on when the patents are published. It can take 4 to 5 years for the application to go through the process. So, one reason we don't see many here is because the patents haven't been granted yet. So we do see things a few things that are coming out. The ones that are coming out in year 4 or 5, that's a pretty immediate response. But you still, I mean, if you take that out, you take out that publication lag, it's taking a good 5, 10 years before the research that's been sponsored really starts to affect the applied technologies. Very quickly, looking at which sources of knowledge are most valuable, we look at who's most likely to be cited. We use university articles as a baseline. In general, university government articles and articles from research institutions are 14% more likely to be cited by a patent. And collaborative patents, so patents that involve, say, a university and a government laboratory, those are the ones that are by far the most likely to be cited. And what's interesting about this excludes self-citation. So it's not just that the laboratory is making the university aware of what they're doing and vice versa. They're actually citing more from other fields. Okay. Find similar results, we look at patent citations as well. So the government patents do tend to be more valuable as well. Finally, thinking about quality publications. Are there diminishing returns? So we do see big fluctuations in R&D spending. So is this going to be troubling? A couple of ways we can test for this. One is we can add an R&D squared term to our model. Right? So does the effect of R&D get smaller? If that's negative, that means the effect of R&D gets smaller as we have bigger and bigger increases. We also try including a dummy variable. So if R&D doubles in a particular year, is the effect smaller? And the short answer to that is no. There is almost no effect of diminishing returns. We evaluate different levels of R&D. We also see no effect of diminishing returns after large funding increases. In fact, we see some evidence of increasing returns, right, that suggests that there may be some positive spillover effects. So the important takeaway of this is there does seem to be room to expand government R&D budgets. There may be an issue about quality, though. It may be that, if you have a little bit of funding, you fund the best applications. If you increase funding, you have to fund some things that might have been marginal, some things you might not have funded if the R&D budget had been smaller. So to do this, we go back to our publication data, and we look at the citations. We look at, as there are more publications in a given year, is any one individual article from that year less likely to be cited? And except for solar, there is some evidence of that. So the evidence is the elasticity about 0.16, 0.18. What that means is that if we had a 10% increase in publications, you might see like a little less than a 2% decrease in the probability of citation. So there's a little bit of evidence that the quality is smaller, but it's not a really big magnitude. What does all this mean for policy? So to wrap things up here. First thing I want to say is I think really to think about how much to spend in public energy R&D really requires an interdisciplinary approach. Right? So as an economist, we can give guidelines as to how do we want to design the policies. Do we have diminishing returns? I mentioned, because that's actually important. If there's diminishing returns, we got to be careful about how much more we spend. Right? We can provide guidelines as what mechanisms we want to use. How can we help to encourage technology transfer? Right? But we need to know about the engineering as well. We need engineers as well, because we don't want to spend money on something if there's not a lot of good projects out there. So to know, are there good ideas that can be funded? I think we really need to spend on engineering for that. What we can say, though, in particular, so what I want to do with this kind of give some guidelines. So depending on engineers coming and saying, well, we have some things that we think are worth funding. What are some guidelines economists can offer in terms of, well, how should we make those funding decisions? How should we allocate that money? One thing that's important is, we want to focus on things that the private sector wouldn't do anyway. We want the public R&D to complement what the private sector does. And so government R&D should focus more on basic research. And that could be things that are technologies that are not yet close to the market, right, that are going to be further out there, and so the profits are going to be farther off in the future. Right? Also, there could be areas of applied research where it might be difficult for private sector to capture the benefits. So things such as improved electricity transmission or energy storage, right? So these are things that are really important to lots of different technologies. Like, one of the big things limiting renewables right now is the ability to connect to the grid and to deal with the fact that renewables are intermittent, and how do we kind of combine that into the broader electrical system. That's really fundamental research, but it's fundamental research that's going to be hard for any one firm to benefit for, because if you're a wind turbine manufacturer and you solve that problem, you're not just solving that problem for yourself, you're solving that problem for every other wind turbine manufacturer, you're solving that problem for solar energy companies, you're solving that problem for all renewables. Right? So you're going to get captured only a small share of that benefit. So those are the types of things where the public sector really can play an important role. Okay. As you mentioned before, government R&D complements other policies. Right? In most cases, public R&D doesn't help bring the final product to market. We need to have technology transfer. We need to have some environmental product policies to complement it. One of the challenges, though, is that so there's a lot of talk. Economists like to say we shouldn't let the market pick winners. So the government shouldn't be an advocate for a particular technology. One point I'd like to make, though, is it's not quite that simple, because even saying we're not advocating a single technology often has the effect of advocating a single technology. So this is an example of some work we did looking at renewable policies in 2010. So if we look in this policy here, in this paper here, we compare the effectiveness of a renewable portfolio standard and feed-in tariffs and a couple other policies. The big takeaway was this. Right? So a renewable portfolio standard is a very flexible policy. It sets a target that countries need to have X% of energy from renewables, but that's a policy that lets the market pick the winners. It doesn't say you have to do wind, you have to do solar, or so on. Well, if you have that kind of policy, all the innovation of those countries goes to wind, because wind is the thing that's closest to being competitive with fossil fuels. And so if you say, I got to use renewables, you're going to use the thing that's closest to being competitive. The countries where we see a lot of research in solar energy are countries such as Germany that used what's called a feed-in tariff. So a feed-in tariff is a guaranteed price, Germany has that for both wind and solar, but they guaranteed a much higher price for solar because they were acknowledging that solar was costlier. And as a result of that, Germany developed a lot of solar technology. Right? So the decision to let the market pick winners is going to also favor certain technologies. And it means that there's going to be a big role for the government R&D. Unless we're willing to have those direct subsidies, something like a feed-in tariff, there's going to be a big role for government R&D to play on those technologies that are further from the market, where we haven't had those big breakthroughs yet. So things that have long-term payoffs or uncertain returns, government R&D is going to be important in those as well. Right? So if we're going to let the market pick the winners, there's a role for government R&D to complement that. If our goal is to have a diverse portfolio of technologies 20 years from now, we're going to need something else to bring those things that are further away to the marketplace. How much to spend? I guess this is where I said, you need to have engineers and economists in the room to figure this out, because economists are going to be able to evaluate, well, how good are these proposals? How good is the prospects in a particular area? We can say there's little evidence for diminishing returns, so there certainly seems to be room to expand R&D budgets. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that adjustment costs are important. What we learned from the evidence from the health sector is that the limits to how much we can spend, at least currently, are less likely to come from the number of deserving projects, but in the existing research infrastructure. If we just doubled the budget in a single year, we're going to be throwing money at researchers that are already out there, funding a lot of things they probably would have done anyway. Right? We want to bring things in gradually so we can try to increase the infrastructure. The idea of this being of these long-term effects, possibly coming from bringing more researchers into the field and stuff, that's something that takes time. And so we want to have the funding increases be steady and gradual. Finally, patience is important. As we said before, 6 to 10 years to see the full effect of funding, and then an additional 3 to 5 years to generate new patent applications. This is important for policymakers because it means that you got to be patient evaluating the effectiveness of public R&D. You can't just look at this and say, well, nothing happened from the funding we gave last year, so it's not working. The other thing is that R&D is uncertain. Some projects are going to fail. Right? The fact that some projects fail doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. If everything's failing, then it's not worth doing. But you're going to have some successes and some failures. That actually can be an important role of the government, right? Because for the private sector, right, if you're a small company, you're a small startup, your project fails, you're out of business. Right? So that the government can come in and can diversify, and it can have some things that fail with some things that are big successes, and those big successes can often be enough to make the entire funding worthwhile. Right? So it's the patience, willing to let some things fail is important. Politically, that can be very difficult to do, right? But it really, I think, is an important part of having this be successful. For research, this means we really do need to include multiple legs when we're evaluating public R&D. These papers that look at just a single leg value, they're probably picking up something else. It's really hard to believe they're really picking up the effect of energy R&D. Okay. So with that, thank you, and we will open it up to questions.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will bring the mic to you.
Right.
Hi, thank you for the talk. And my question is about in the model that about the number of publications that happen along the time. Mm-hmm. That if you include the previous publications that happen, could that have an impact in the future number of publications as you use in the patents?
It's a good question. So I haven't tried that, so I can't say for certain. I would you could expect that potentially that it does. I mean, it's again we've seen those long legs. That may be one reason that those long legs matter, right? That there's a publication that comes out 2 to 3 years after the funding. That leads to new work, and so you see that come in 6, 7, 8 years. That's certainly a possibility, yes. And that's something I haven't specifically looked at. But it's a good question.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
Clearly in 08 and 09, the big financial crisis in the U.S., there was a drastic spike in the spending for, was it spending for R&D?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yep.
Is there any specific reasoning for that?
That was part of the Recovery Act. And it's a little different. It's a little different than, as I mentioned, the evidence that there was this big spike at National Institutes of Health that caused a lot of problems. It's a little different from that in that it was, because it was part of the stimulus, it was designed to be things, it was kind of like the same thing they had for infrastructure, these shovel-ready things. I mean, so I remember, I don't know if you were doing research, I remember, there were calls for research that came out from various agencies, and they were really short, they were to say, we'll fund this 4-6-month exploratory thing. So it was designed to be kind of seed money, it was designed to get money back into the economy really quickly. So that's what it was designed to do. I haven't seen much because it's only been a couple of years. I haven't seen a lot of studies really looking at the effect. I've seen things looking at the effectiveness of some of the other things spending they had, where it was more direct, like spending money on energy efficiency, infrastructure or something. I haven't seen much look at the effectiveness of that specifically on R&D, just because it takes a little longer to look at. But it was a little different than the typical R&D funding. It wasn't like all of a sudden they were putting out 3 times as many 3-year grants for research. It was really these smaller kind of seed money things to get money out quickly.
Okay. Thank you.
On the waves you talked about in those graphs that you had, that you mentioned you hadn't really gotten into, but maybe it was more of having, new students coming into PhDs. Have you looked at maybe the new technologies, how that affects these waves that you were talking about, like as new technologies for testing certain research come out, that would affect?
So we have, so that kind of leads back to the earlier question. So it kind of suggests there's 2 potential things that be going on here. One is an increase in people working on it. The other is that these ideas kind of lead to the next wave. So the way you would test it would be to put kind of these legged, the previous research into the model and see what kind of impact that has. So you can think of this as kind of it's what economists call a reduced form. We kind of get that there is an effect, but we can't really say what the effect is. We can't really separate out how much is due to labor supply, how much of it is due to people building on the R&D. And what I'd like to be able to do is use, because the database actually includes authors' names, to be able to see if I can say something about the labor supply aspect of it. I've been trying to figure out how to get around, it's last names and first initials, so how do we get around the common last names that occur? But that would, once you can start to separate that out, then you kind of think about how much it is one versus the other. I think it's a great next, for those of you thinking about a research idea, I think it's a great next question to look at. So.
Thank you again for coming and the presentation. On one of your first pages where you had the 6 different emissions reducing policies in sort of rank order, it was very interesting. Mm-hmm. It seemed like it was a mix of demand pull mechanisms,
yep,
tax, and technology push. And that looks intuitively compelling. Are there particular mixes of those? I think you mentioned something about an emissions tax plus an R&D subsidy is a nice mix. I didn't hear whether that pushed it well beyond the 95%. What are the pairings that might potentiate each other more, or is that too complex to really be able to sift out?
Those papers don't specifically, I'm trying to remember actually if the Fisher Newell paper looked at some of the pairings. I'm not sure how much they did on that. And I'm not sure how much they would be able to get at that, because they looked at, one of the reasons R&D doesn't fare well in their models, it is, if they compare that to, go back to that slide, it's like, let's put this in context. Go way back here. The Fisher Newell study is more of a short-run study. It's a dynamic study, and they look at multiple periods, but it's kind of the research is done in period 1, then we see the outcome in period 2. This more recent study by Acemoglu is a longer. It's a it's a 100-200 year simulation of climate policy, and so this one gets a little different. So this one can say more about the timing. This idea that maybe we spend the R&D first, and then phase that out and bring the carbon tax in. I think thinking about the mix, I think there's certainly a role for R&D to play, even if it is just a carbon tax. The role is somewhat different, I think, depending on what type of energy. The more general so you talk about technology push, the supply side and demand side stuff. The more general the demand side forcing technologies are, right, the more role there is for government R&D to play on the things that are further away from the market. Right? So if it is just a carbon tax, if it is renewable portfolio standards, that's not going to do a lot to get solar to the market. That's not going to do a lot to deal with carbon capture and storage, because those things are just so much more expensive right now. Right? If you have, a case like Germany, where so Germany put in high feed-in tariffs, because there was high feed-in tariffs in Germany, the private sector was doing a lot on solar. So they didn't, there wouldn't be a big role for public sector in that case. So the subsidy, so you can think of it as this kind of, you're going to need a subsidy somehow to get the things that are further from the market up to this point where they're competitive. You could do it, so these models are kind of more general. So, a lot of these climate models just use a carbon tax and they leave it to the markets. So to do that, you really do need the R&D funding. So you could do it with R&D subsidies, or you can do it with a very specific demand side subsidies, such as a feed-in tariff, or such as California having their initiative, the Million Solar Roofs initiative. But there needs to be something focused on that technology if your goal really is to bring those things that are further away from the market and get them closer.
And then follow up on that is, would a cap and trade mechanism be in that same category as emissions price, carbon tax, or less efficient?
Cap and trade, so it depends how it's designed. Cap and trade in principle could be practically equivalent to emission price. It depends on, depends on where you're putting a safety valve or something in, but it would be, I'm guessing if they were to put cap and trade in, it would probably be either equivalent to that or maybe like 1.5 or something, but yeah.
Okay. And then you're doing the measurement from the initial R&D to papers and patents. Is there anyone doing the next leg that says, here's papers or patents to actual productization, commercial availability?
It's hard to do. Did a little bit of that. So I've done stuff. I haven't done with the publications. I've done with patents, where you kind of aggregate the patents up over time. There's a few papers that do this, and look at for example, the amount of investment that's in that's in the country in renewables. Plays some role. Policy tends to play a bigger role. Because these still are things that are expensive enough that even it's not just technology. Another area, so I'm looking at energy, but I've done some work looking at pollution control technologies, and what we find there was, again, policy is really important. You're not going to use a pollution control technology unless you have a policy, unless there's a policy in place, because all it does is increase the firm's cost. But what we do find there is that the availability of technology increases the probability that a country will put a policy in place. I haven't done that same thing for renewable policy, but you can imagine that, again, that is the case. The technology by making it cheaper to comply, makes politicians more willing to put that policy in place. One of the interesting things that I found in that paper, which does suggest that it is a technology, is that countries that are more open to trade, the effect of that knowledge with patents is larger, because they're more likely to get access to those technologies.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I had a question, it's a little bit kind of tangential. So in your presentation, you focus a lot on how government grants and collaborations ought to focus on basic research or stuff that's kind of far from the market. Mm-hmm. What sort of effect do you think ARPA-E has on the dynamics of the R&D market, and now and at the peak, once the first lag time expires?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. So I think ARPA-E in some sense, there's a question of how much funding we want to have, but I think ARPA-E probably has the right idea in terms of trying to focus on breakthrough things. So which also means, it goes back to the last slide where patience is important, right? That you're probably not going to see a lot of impact on ARPA-E on commercialization right away, because a lot of it is more basic. There is some. Actually, the National Academy of Science is doing a review of ARPA-E right now, kind of the first wave of projects. And there have been some things that come out that have actually, they have gotten to markets. They have fun of some things where it was kind of like seed money to get stuff out. So I think it certainly has played a role. ARPA-E is a little different than the stuff here in that it's definitely aimed at more applied things, right? So it's aimed more at companies rather than universities, for example. So that's where if it's going to have an influence in the market, that's where it's going to have that influence. But you can think of it also as think of it almost like a venture capital sort of role. So.
Do you think it has effects in terms of crowding out and things of that nature?
That's a really good question. I don't know enough about it to say for certain. my sense is they're not doing things that are, they're not finding things that are so close to market that it would be crowding out, but there's certainly, I mean, that's something you always need to be careful about in those types of projects. And there's some recent work that looked at venture capital. Venture capital has become more important from the private sector. And so, if there is crowding out, that would really be the risk, that it's kind of like a government venture capital versus private sector venture capital. But I haven't seen enough, I haven't looked closely enough to say for certain one way or the other. So, but you can certainly imagine where the risk would be there. It is a good question. Okay. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you. I was hoping you could expand on, I guess, as far as the use of dummy variables for regime type, because I can imagine that could get pretty, I guess, sort of complicated pretty quick. I mean, as far as, was it conservative liberal, or was it political system, or?
So it's conservative liberal. I think middle of the road was the admitted category, and it's taken from a database. There is actually a database that does this for each country. It was based on the party in power, so it became the equivalent of, in the U.S. it'd be the equivalent of the executive branch. So it's kind of, it's a bit of a crude proxy, but it's kind of a way of getting a sense of, how important is green versus, think of kind of liberal being green or something, how important that is politically. And that's why, it certainly by itself doesn't do much, but that's why I try to include also the things on, why I try to also include the things like the share of public spending and stuff to kind of use, the goal is to have those multiple dimensions, kind of get at how important is the public sector and how green might the public sector be. One of the reasons that's important is because you can imagine a lot of those things also affect the decisions. So my other set of instruments are the related energy types, and all those things would affect those related energy types. So we really want to make sure we've controlled for that, so we can say conditional on any political shocks that are going on, how important is just the willingness to fund alternative energy. So.